Well, we start this second unit of the course out by reading a very important, historically influential essay by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? You may have read Kant in different classes or different contexts before. He was one of those incredibly important thinkers, a philosopher who wrote about epistemology, metaphysics, morality, but also about everything else. He might have been the most important philosopher in the modern periods, after people like Plato and Aristotle. And it's a difficult read, much of it. But this is a newspaper piece. I don't know what the newspaper was, but there were many in the late 18th century. Suppose you could find out. But they had asked sort of an open question, responded to by many German thinkers. The question, what is enlightenment? What does it mean? What is the definition of the word? And Kant, amongst many others, responded to it with this classic essay. So I'd like to just say a few things about the essay and perhaps why we're starting with it. Well, I'll tell you right away why we're starting with it. It is, to my mind, the classic sort of irreplaceable statement in history defending not the right to free speech directly, though that may be implied, but the absolute necessity for any society to have it. And as you'll see, though, in a limited way. Uh, what is enlightenment? Kant says, to begin with, it is man's emergence from self-incurred immaturity. And that immaturity, he says, is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. So the lack of enlightenment is the lack of using one's reason independently to think for oneself. That is, one would suppose that what differentiates an enlightened from an unenlightened individual is that the enlightened individual does think for him or herself. And Kant thinks that this lack is a moral lack. That is, that it's not an intellectual deficit, it is a moral failing, a lack of courage, a lack of resolution, he says, resolution and courage. That we have to have the courage, we have to have the daring, as he says, sapere aude, dare to know, that we have to have the daring to think for ourselves, to come up with our own beliefs, attitudes, opinions, our best guess at the truth, but to do it for ourselves. And that's enlightenment on the individual level, I suppose. But this essay is more than how he thinks individuals become enlightened. It is a social essay. It's a political essay. In fact, he says here, there is more chance of an entire public enlightening itself than an individual. And that leads us really into our real interest in here, in this. How does society enlighten itself? What has to be in place to have a society that's moving towards enlightenment? And he says that there's really only one thing that's needed, and that is freedom, and a specific or a specification of freedom. That is, for society to move towards enlightenment, it needs to be free. But what sort of freedom are we talking about? He says the freedom in question is the most innocuous form of all, freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. And he makes a very important distinction between the public use of reason and the private use of reason. And his argument is that the private use of reason may legitimately be curtailed, it may be limited. But what he's insisting on is that the public use of reason has to be remain free, and my reading is absolutely free. The private use of reason is the use of reason that we make when we are representatives of some institution, or in some way or another have the obligation to uphold the orthodoxy of that institution. When you're like members of the clergy, you cannot say, at least in front of your parishioners or the group of people that you have this responsibility to. You can't sort of just say anything you want. You have to some degree, hew to the party line or the orthodoxy of that institution. As he says, a clergyman is bound to instruct his pupils and his congregation in accordance with the doctrine of the church he serves, for he was employed by it on that condition. So as an example of the private use of reason, let's say giving a sermon as a representative of a particular church, or you could be any kind of religious leader. Not he's thinking of Protestant ones, but you could be a Catholic priest, it could be a rabbi, you could be an imam, whatever. That you simply have to accept the basic tenets and principles of the church that you, or the religious institution that you are representing. But then he goes on to say, but as a scholar, he is completely free, as well as obliged to impart to the public all his carefully considered, well-intentioned thoughts on the mistaken aspects of those doctrines, and to offer suggestions for a better arrangement of religious and ecclesiastical affairs. And there is nothing in this, he continues, which need trouble the conscience. That is, he's talking about different roles. In your role, let's say, you may think of this in terms of being an employee. What you say in your role as the employee and representative, let's say, of your company, you may feel that you are restrained in what you can say, and to what degree you can criticize the actions or philosophy of that company. But there should be nothing that restrains you from taking on another role. And he repeatedly characterizes as the role of the scholar in criticizing that very same company, not as an employee, but as a public person, or as an intellectual, or as a scholar. And I think that, at least in my way of dealing with this and trying to understand this distinction in my years of reading this and thinking about it, is that it really depends on what audience you are addressing. If you are speaking to the public, whatever that means, we can even think of the public with a capital P. I mean, when a novelist writes a novel, who does he or she write it for? Seemingly everyone. When you write an editorial for a newspaper, or write a letter to the editor, whom are you addressing? Seemingly everyone, as opposed to in our other roles when we are addressing more limited audiences for different purposes. And I would say that if you wanted to say there's one thing that this essay is about, it's the defense of that public use of reason, or the defense of the absolute freedom of the person who is in the context of addressing the public at large, everyone. And that for any society which has any hope for improving itself, that is the most important thing that it can provide, is some space in which that kind of absolutely free exchange of ideas or promulgation of ideas exists. And that if we were to say that there is no such space where people are allowed to say whatever they think, their best guess as the truth, then we have basically consigned ourselves to perpetual ignorance. That is, if he goes so far, and we'll pick this up in another talk, but he goes so far as to say that were we to not have that space, we would be committing a crime against our very nature as human beings.